3 orphaned Shoshone children were torn from the only safe place they'd found and handed over to a military outpost, simply because they weren't one of us. Behind it all stood Henry Miller, a man whose personal hatred poisoned an entire town's judgment. But their teacher, Jonathan Brown, rode into the unknown, unarmed, and returned with 450 warriors at his back. Just wait until you see how this standoff ended, and why justice, in the end, did more than prevail. Morning on the border of Wyoming and Idaho territory began with a sharp, bone-deep chill and a wind the color of ash, drifting like a ghost from the Yowie snow-dusted peaks. The prairie stretched silent and pale, broken only by the low smoke rising from a few cabins and the creak of frozen timber. On the eastern edge of the settlement of Levin Creek stood a one-room schoolhouse, rough-hewn, humble, and lonesome. Its wood was grayed from storms, its windows streaked with frost. Behind the single door, the world seemed paused, waiting for heat, waiting for life. Inside, Jonathan Brown pinned a map of North America to the wall with a bent nail and steady hand. His fingers, long and calloused, had once dressed battlefield wounds. He was a former army medic, now a school teacher, by choice but not by dream. The war had taken his youth, disease had taken his wife and child in Kansas, and grief had driven him west, past places with names and into this cold outpost where silence echoed louder than gunfire ever had. He didn't speak much, didn't smile often. But each morning he rose before dawn, stoked the iron stove, laid out inkwells, chalk, and paper, and stood before the blackboard as if something depended on it. Perhaps something did. Then came the knock, quiet, unsure, barely more than the scrape of a twig in wind. He paused, hand midair over a stack of slates. Again the knock, so faint he almost convinced himself he imagined it. He crossed the room, unlatched the door, and opened it. 3 children stood before him, thin, barefoot, shivering. The oldest, a boy maybe 10 years old, met Jonathan's eyes with a strange kind of defiance, tired but unbroken. His jaw was clenched, fists trembling at his sides. Beside him, a girl of about 8 clutched a smaller child, bundled in tattered cloth, more blanket than body. Their skin, their hair, the lines of their faces told a story before a single word was spoken. They were Shoshone, hated, feared, hunted. "We didn't steal," the boy whispered. "We just ran." Jonathan didn't ask where from. He didn't ask who sent them or what happened to their parents. He only opened the door wider, stepped aside, and let them in. No questions, just mercy. Word traveled fast in Levin Creek. Before the second bell had rung that day, whispers had already left the general store and made it to the church steps. That evening, the air thickened with rumor like the promise of storm. One man in particular, Henry Miller, a farmer whose brother had died years earlier in a skirmish near Snake River, took the news like a personal betrayal. By the next morning, Miller stormed into the school board meeting, his voice shaking with fury. "You're sheltering savages," he shouted, pointing a thick finger at Jonathan. "They killed our kin. And you feed them? Let them sit next to our boys like they belong?" "They're children, Henry," Jonathan answered, standing straight. "Not warriors, not killers, just children." And they had nowhere else to go. No one clapped. No one nodded. Eyes stayed down. Silence agreed with fear. That night, someone set fire to the school's chalkboard. Jonathan woke to the smell of smoke, stumbled into the dark, and doused the flames before they reached the roof. The air stung his eyes and chest as he crouched in the snow, watching embers flicker and die. He didn't need to guess who did it. He knew. And in the smoldering dark, as the wind picked up and the last sparks faded, he understood one thing with perfect clarity. This was only the beginning dot. The silence inside the schoolhouse had changed. It was no longer peaceful or shy. It was heavy, taut, like a thread stretched too thin. The children had stopped speaking during lessons, their eyes flicking to the windows whenever hooves passed by outside. Fear hung around them like winter mist, unseen but clinging. Cody, the youngest, had stopped talking entirely. He clung to his sister Lila, even during class, refusing to let go of her hand. His small frame trembled if anyone came too close, and he flinched at raised voices, even laughter. Lila, once the brave one, cried softly at night in the cot behind the stove, careful to muffle herself in the pillow so as not to wake the others. She had begun to believe the hatred outside was somehow her fault. It was Tahoe who carried the weight of their survival. At 10 years old, he had the eyes of someone far older. He sat at his desk each morning, back straight, jaw set. When other children whispered about him, or worse, when their parents pulled them from the school entirely, he didn't flinch. He only grew quieter. But one evening, as Jonathan was grading spelling papers under the lantern's glow, Tahoe stepped forward. "Will you leave too?" he asked quietly. "Like everyone else?" Jonathan looked up, surprised by how steady the boy's voice sounded. He set his pen down, leaned forward. "No, son, I'm staying, all the way." For a moment, Tahoe didn't move. Then he nodded once and turned away, shoulders just a little straighter than before. But outside those four walls, the pressure was building. The school board had convened an emergency meeting. Farmers, tradesmen, and ministers argued not over the children's safety, but their presence. They called it a risk, an insult, a threat to community order. Their solution was swift and cold. The children were to be handed over to the military outpost near Red Bluff Crossing. Officially, the justification was relocation for proper processing, but everyone in that room knew what that meant. The children would likely be sent into a holding camp, maybe farther. Beyond that, no one asked, and no one cared to know. Only Jonathan and one other soul, Mary Sloan, the gray-haired town librarian who had lost her own son years earlier, voted against the motion. Two voices drowned in a tide of silence. Jonathan returned to the school with dread tightening in his chest. He didn't tell the children that night. He couldn't. The thought of watching them taken away, of handing them off to men in uniforms and watching those small hands disappear into the horizon, made his stomach twist. But the decision wasn't left to process. The next morning, as arithmetic lessons began, the school door burst open. Two men stepped inside. One was Henry Miller. The other, his brother-in-law, a big man with a beard like a shovel and eyes that didn't blink. They didn't knock. They didn't speak to Jonathan. They went straight for Tahoe. "You think these children belong here?" Miller spat. "These savages don't get to read books meant for our sons." Tahoe rose from his chair but didn't move, not until rough hands grabbed him by the arm. Jonathan stood between them without thinking. Let him go. It took only a second. A shove, a raised arm, the crack of wood against skin. He felt the floor spin before darkness swallowed everything whole. When he came to, dusk had turned the room dim. His head throbbed beneath a bandage, his vision blurred. The children's cots were empty. The silence this time was different. Final. A knock came at the back door. Mrs. Albright, the neighbor, stood with her bonnet clutched in both hands, her eyes darting to the sides. She leaned in close and whispered, "They took him to the southern checkpoint. Said they had orders. You best hurry, Mr. Brown. They won't wait till morning." Jonathan didn't ask for clarification. He already knew. Where they were going, children didn't come back. At first light, with the frost still clinging to the low brush and the horizon just beginning to shift from black to blue, Jonathan saddled his horse in silence. He didn't pack much, just a rolled blanket, a satchel of dried bread, and a folder of documents proving his role as a guardian. No rifle, no sidearm. He rode alone, wind biting at his coat, heading south toward the military outpost near Red Bluff Crossing, where the children had last been seen. Every hoofbeat echoed like a ticking clock. Time was running out. The sun was halfway up when he arrived. The outpost was crude but guarded. Soldiers lounged outside the barracks, steam rising from their tin mugs. Jonathan dismounted, dusted the road from his coat, and approached the gate without flinching. A young private greeted him but quickly disappeared behind the main building when Jonathan asked for the commanding officer. Captain Whitmore was a tall man with polished boots and a face sharpened by regulation. He walked with the certainty of someone who had never been questioned, especially not by civilians. Jonathan handed him the papers. "I have legal standing," he said firmly. "These children have no parents. I took them in under emergency care, approved by the town clerk. They're under my protection until formal placement." The captain didn't even glance at the papers. Instead, he chuckled, low and cold. "They're not citizens," he said flatly. "You can't protect something that isn't property of the law." He stepped closer, voice dropping with deliberate weight. "They're not yours to keep, and they're not yours to speak for. You don't get to claim wild animals as dependents, schoolmaster." Jonathan's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. Not then. There was no reasoning to be done here, no justice to be appealed, Only walls, uniforms, and indifference. By dusk, he was back on the open plain, far from the outpost's firelight, the wind turning colder, sharper. He stopped beside a dry creek bed and built a small fire from broken sagebrush, then spread out an old map the children had once drawn on with charcoal. There, just northwest past the ravines near Black Ridge, they had traced a circle and written a single word in shaky letters: home. He stared at it, then folded the map and stood. He would go, alone, if he had to. The journey was long and barren. The land was quiet, almost watching him as he rode deeper into the unknown. He had no idea what would happen, whether he'd find the camp, whether they'd let him speak, whether he'd be seen as enemy or fool. But he knew one thing: he would not turn back. It was near dawn when two riders spotted him, dark shapes against the pale sky. They approached fast, weapons visible, eyes narrowed with suspicion. Before they could speak, Jonathan raised his hands, slowly dismounted, and called out, "I'm looking for the Shoshone camp. I need to speak with the chief." The men did not answer. One stepped forward, his horse circling. He motioned for Jonathan's belongings, which were willingly handed over. His fingers lingered near the knife at his belt, but he didn't draw it. "They're children," Jonathan said, voice steady. "Tahoe, Lila, Cody?" The names struck like thunder. One of the riders paled, his lips parting slightly. He turned to the other and murmured in a low voice. Jonathan caught only fragments. One word repeated: nephews. They rode in silence after that. The sun climbed slowly as they descended into a hidden valley where smoke rose in gentle trails and dozens of domed lodges formed a quiet circle around a central fire. Eyes followed them as they entered, young, old, suspicious. Some reached for bows, others simply watched. Jonathan was led to the largest lodge and asked to wait. Minutes passed, then the door flap opened and a tall man stepped inside. His presence filled the room before he spoke. He wore a simple cloak of tanned leather, hair braided, and eyes that held generations. Jonathan stood. "My name is Jonathan Brown. I came for the children. I came to ask for help." The chief said nothing. He motioned for Jonathan to sit. For the next hour, then 2, then 3, Jonathan spoke, not to plead, not to justify, but to explain. He told him everything: the knock on the door, the silence in class, the fire, the vote, the abduction. He said their names with care, not as tokens, as lives. "They're not things to be passed between sides," he said quietly. "They are not tools or trophies. They are children. And if I am the only one who stands for them, then I stand." The lodge was silent. Fire crackled low between them. Then the chief, Mahuan, rose. He reached for his robe of dark blue, one only worn in matters of war or ceremony. He laid it over his shoulders, tied it without a word, and looked out at the sleeping hills. "In the morning," he said, voice deep and calm, "we ride, all of us." The morning broke gold and breathless. Sunlight poured over the frozen ridges like honey over stone, casting long shadows across the prairie. Frost clung to every blade of grass, every rail, every rooftop in Levin Creek. A soft mist rose from the valley below, and through it came a sight the townsfolk would never forget. Moving silently through the fog was a formation, swift, steady, solemn. They came not with banners or drums, but with purpose in their eyes and silence in their step. 450 Shoshone warriors descended from the hills in a great arc, their silhouettes stretching across the frozen plain like a tide. Horses moved in rhythm, hooves muffled by frost. No words were spoken. They didn't need to be. At their head rode a child, Tahoe. Perched on a chestnut pony, face marked with a healing cut across his cheek, he sat proud and still, his gaze fixed on the schoolhouse in the distance. Behind him came Lila, wrapped in a woven shawl, holding Cody close against her chest. The siblings were no longer hidden in shadows. They were returned as something sacred. The settlement froze. Men on porches stood still, rifles in hand but lowered, unsure if they were seeing a vision or something real. Mothers pulled children back from windows. Fear thickened in the air like smoke before a storm. Henry Miller stepped out of his barn, rifle slung over his shoulder, lips tight. He squinted at the line of riders, then saw a familiar shape standing at the edge of the schoolhouse porch. Jonathan Brown. He stood tall, unarmed, beside Chief Mahuan, who had not dismounted. Jonathan's coat fluttered gently in the breeze, and his eyes never left Miller's. "You want a war, Henry?" he called, loud enough to cross the stillness. "Start with me, but know this. Today we're not here for land. We're here for 3 children." The silence that followed was complete. It was not fear that held them now, but something deeper, a reckoning. Then came the sound no one expected, the click of a hammer easing down. An elder stepped forward from the gathered townspeople. His name was Elias Reed, a father of 3 boys in the school. Slowly he lowered his rifle and placed it on the ground. His voice, though soft, cut through the air. "We raised them to be better than us," he said. "Today's their test, and ours." One by one, rifles were lowered. Others followed. Young men, old men, women who had once whispered behind curtained windows. No one cheered, but the message was clear. There would be no blood. Jonathan took a step forward and opened his arms. Tahoe slid down from his pony and ran to him, followed closely by Lila and Cody. The embrace was wordless. Chief Mahoan watched and after a moment bowed his head, not in defeat, but in peace. A week later, the school reopened. This time, things were different. 2 new maps hung on the wall, one in English, one in Shoshone. The alphabet lessons were written in both tongues. And every morning, before the bell rang, 3 children stood at the steps. Their clothing had been stitched by hands from both the settlement and the camp. Tahoe, Lila, Cody. The story of what happened that day spread far beyond the borders of Levin Creek. It became something more than legend. Something lived. Because that morning, a boundary stopped being just a mark on a map. It became a turning point. A place where justice wasn't measured by bloodline or skin, but by courage and heart. And the name Jonathan Brown was remembered not for the battles he'd fought in uniform, but for the one he chose to fight without one.